So Tibor tonight is going to talk some of the stories you're going to hear. He's a member, as you see up here, of the JCRC Holocaust Speakers Bureau volunteer group, and he is a second generation survivor. He is going to tell you stories of his Hungarian Jewish family using photos, maps, and illustrations. And some of the themes he will cover not only were themes in the past, but you'll also see how they relate to today's time. I've had the pleasure of listening to him in the past in Indianapolis, and I really think you are going to enjoy this talk tonight. So we want to welcome you and welcome Tibor.
Well, thank you, Stella, for that introduction. I hope you do enjoy and learn from this presentation. Obviously, you'll see PowerPoint slides here. I also want to mention that there's a small computer right underneath the projector there. You'll see faces on that screen. About every minute, you'll see a different face. And I'm going to tell you more about that a little bit later in my presentation. So, as Stella said, I'm a volunteer Holocaust education speaker. Now, I don't have any professional credentials for teaching about the Holocaust, but I do have ample personal credentials. And those credentials are simply my family members. You can see a few of their faces on the screen right now. Those family members experienced the Holocaust firsthand simply because my family is Jewish and from the European country of Hungary. So I heard my family stories mostly from my mother and from one of my uncles, but it wasn't until I learned more about the history of World War II that I was able to understand how my family members' individual stories and experiences really fit into the history of the Holocaust. I think it's important to understand some broad background about World War II in order to comprehend how Adolf Hitler and the Nazis came to power in Germany. That background includes the devastating penalties, forfeitures of territories, and other consequences that Germany suffered from losing World War I, as well as the economic devastations of hyperinflation and the Great Depression in Germany that hit the German people very hard. Those circumstances combined to fuel the opportunity for the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and the Nazis' racial superiority theories that backed their master race and white supremacist philosophies were critical drivers of their success in taking control of Germany and undermining democracy in the country and instituting a populist, nationalist, and fascist government there. Are any of you history buffs, perchance? No, I see some of you are. I know John is. He's getting a PhD in history. So I think you will especially appreciate some parts of my presentation this evening. This past summer, I spoke at the Kokomo-Howard County Public Library in conjunction with a traveling exhibit called Americans and the Holocaust. Now, this exhibit was sponsored by the National Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and it presented a historical perspective on what the American government and what the American public knew and did about the Holocaust during the 1930s and the 1940s. And it also presented Americans' views on and responses to racial discrimination, the war, refugees, and immigrants during that period of time. Did any of you happen to see that traveling exhibit? Okay, well, the focus on Americans and the Holocaust was different and interesting for me, and I thought you might find it interesting as well. One thing that I found interesting about that exhibit is that it started off by illustrating that the racial superiority theories underlying the Nazi philosophy were not unique to Germany, and in fact were prevalent and indeed popular here in the United States through at least the 1930s and the 1940s. Here in the Lafayette area, just as one example, Purdue University admitted a few black students, but its on-campus housing system completely excluded black students until 1947, when they started making some occasional exceptions. Now, our American Jim Crow era of racial segregation and local, state, and federal government sanctioned discrimination against blacks and other minorities was frankly not that much different from the core German Nazi philosophy that Germans were a superior race and that other people were inferior. As in the United States, with its broad discrimination against so-called non-whites, people of color, brown or yellow skin. In Germany, in addition to Jews, the Nazis targeted also people of color. They targeted the Roma or Sinti people, or Gypsies as they're sometimes called, communists and socialists because of their political views, gay men and women because of their sexual orientation, and even Roman Catholics and Jehovah's Witnesses because of their religion. And this master race and white supremacist and nationalist world view fueled not only the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s and World War II, but also the Holocaust, that is the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews and millions of other innocent people because of their ethnicity, race, or beliefs. Now, I can't tell you everything there is to know about the Holocaust, and I think in some ways the war and the Holocaust are best really understood not as a history lesson focusing on global trends and dates and events and statistics, but through the stories of individual people and families. So what I'd like to do this evening is introduce you to my family members and tell you their stories. Hungary, up on the screen there, where my family is from, is a small landlocked country right in the middle of Europe. The map shows its location, and Hungary is roughly the size of Indiana. At the beginning of World War II, the population of Hungary totaled about 9 million people, and about 800,000 of those Hungarians were Jews. Nearly all of my family members were among those 800,000 Jews, and they lived mostly here in the northwestern part of the country. Now, I was born in 1954, so I'm too young myself to be a survivor of the Holocaust, but both my parents lived through the Holocaust. They were survivors. My mother's name is Manci, short for Margit in Hungarian. My father's name is Mishi, short for Mihai, or Michael in English. Their photos taken in the late 1930s before the war are up here on the screen. I also want to introduce you at this point to my mother's youngest brother, my uncle Alex. Alex was born in February of 1926. He was 13 when the photo up on the screen was taken. He was 13 and a half years old when the war began, and 19 at the end of the war in 1945. Alex, like my parents, is another survivor. And until a few years ago, when Alex's health declined, Alex and I often spoke together to school groups and groups like this about the Holocaust. Some of you may have seen the timeline of posters outside our room here, and those posters tell Alex's own story in some detail. So we had a large extended family in Hungary before the war. Are any of you from large families? I see a few hands. Most of you are too shy to admit that, I suspect. So those of you with big families, you've probably gotten to know lots of aunts and uncles and cousins and other relatives at family reunions, weddings, celebrating holidays, and other events. So here's a photograph from a wedding in my family in the early or mid 1930s. My mother is in the back row, fourth from the left. She was around 20 or 22 years old. I don't know the exact date of this photo. She and my father weren't married yet, and in fact, they didn't even know each other. Also in this photo is one of my mother's aunts, Gizush. While Gizush was my mother's aunt, they happened to be the same age. So here's another family event. This is my mother's and Uncle Alex's grandparents, my great-grandparents, 50th wedding anniversary in January of 1939. This photo was taken in the small village of Kunsigat, where my great-grandparents lived. My great-grandfather and great-grandmother, Lajos and Rozi Singer, are here in the middle. They had 9 children, which is one reason why my extended family was large. And all their children and grandchildren are not in this photo, but here's Uncle Alex on the far right side. He's wearing the short pants that were common for boys in that era, even in winter. And if you look closely at this faded photo, you can see some snow on the ground. Hungary's weather is similar to Indiana's, so snow in January was nothing unusual. Now, my mother had to work that day and she couldn't attend, but here's my mother's aunt, Gizush. Gizush happened to be the youngest of the Singer children. Now, these next photos here were also taken in Kunsiget. My great-grandfather, Lajos Singer, started a general store in Kunsiget around 1890, and it was right on the main square, along with the Catholic Church. Most Hungarians are Catholic. There was also a Catholic school, and the parish priest's house, or rectory or paplot in Hungarian, was right there too. My great-grandfather's store, with their home on the back side of the building, was right next to the parish priest's house, and my grandfather was good friends with the parish priest. Uncle Alex remembers them sitting on the back porch, playing cards, drinking spritzers, that's wine mixed with carbonated water, in the evenings. Gizush and her family, including her 2 young daughters, Vera and Zsófi, also lived in Kunsiget with her parents. Here are photos of her with the girls. The picture you see here in the lower right side shows the girls with their paternal grandfather. You might recognize him as the father of the bride in the wedding photo that I showed you a few minutes ago. Next are 2 photos of Alex's and my mother's immediate family, the Csillog family. The first photo is the family in the winter of 1936-1937. Uncle Alex and my mother are on the far right side in that photo. Now, you heard me refer to my uncle earlier as Alex Starr, not Alex Csillog. When Alex came to the United States in 1952, he decided that his last name, Csillog, was too hard for Americans to pronounce or to spell, so he translated the name to English. Csillog is the Hungarian word for star. Now, young Piri, my mother and Alex's youngest sibling, is on the left in that front row of that left-hand picture. She was about 3 years old in that photo. The second photo on this slide was taken by my Uncle Joe, Uncle Alex's and my mother's oldest brother. It was in the summer of 1939, right outside their home at 27 Varos Street in the village of Seal. My mother is in the middle in the back row. She was 25. To her right is my Uncle Louis. He was about 20. To her left is my Uncle Paul, who was 18. And the kids are in the front row. My Uncle Alex, who was by then 13, and my young Aunt Petey, who was then 5 years old. And of course, they're sitting next to their parents, my grandparents. Now let me tell you a little bit about my father's family. It was pretty big too. He had 3 sisters, Rozi, Gizush, and Magda, pictured here. And he also had an older brother, Arpad, who he looked up to. My father married just before the war on August 15, 1939, although not to my mother. This is a wedding photo of my father and his first wife. It wasn't until he passed away when I was in college that my mother told me for the first time that my father had been married before the war and that his first wife and their 2 young daughters died in the Holocaust at the Auschwitz concentration camp. It wasn't until some time later that it hit me that those young girls were my sisters. I don't have any photographs of them. I don't even know their names. Now, shortly after these 1939 photos were taken, World War II formally began with Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. At the beginning of the war, the nation of Hungary, like Italy, had a fascist government and was allied with Nazi Germany. Here in the United States, as explained in the Americans and the Holocaust exhibit, there was a strong movement to stay out of the war, to be neutral and not to take sides, or maybe even to be sympathetic to the German point of view. Well-known and powerful thought leaders advocated hard for neutrality. That ultimately led to the formation of the America First Committee, headed up by Robert E. Wood, a retired Army general and chairman then of Sears Roebuck and Company. Other prominent leaders and spokespersons included Henry Ford, the industrialist and automobile manufacturing pioneer, and Charles Lindbergh, the aviator. So back to Europe in the early years of the war, the Nazi government in Germany rewarded Hungary for being its ally by allowing Hungary to govern its own internal affairs, and also by giving Hungary back some of the territories taken from it some 20 years earlier at the end of World War I. This map on the screen shows the territories that Hungary lost in the war. That's kind of the big blob in the middle there is the Hungarian Empire before the war. And that war ended disastrously for the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its allies, Germany and the Ottoman Empire. Now, I'm explaining this historical background because Germany and its allies' defeat in World War I and the fines and penalties or reparations that were imposed on Germany with that defeat laid the groundwork for the political, economic, and social climate that allowed the Nazis to rise to power in post-World War I Germany. In those hard times, with the population suffering from lack of food, lack of jobs, runaway inflation, and a worldwide economic depression, the Nazis found that it was politically useful to blame so-called outsiders for the hardship suffered by the German population and economy. And Jews were one of the main groups of people that they blamed. And by the way, the strategy of blaming others for problems and labeling them as outsiders is a common diversion technique used by populist and right-wing nationalist and nativist political parties, both in history and even today. Following the Nazi German lead, the Hungarian government was also anti-Jewish, although it was not quite as brutal as the Nazis in Germany or in the captured territories like Poland. Still, the Hungarian government followed Germany's example and adopted laws that made life difficult for the Jews. For example, beginning in 1938, there were restrictions on occupations and ownership of property by Jews that made it difficult for Jews to work and earn a living. And there were also laws that limited education for Jews. Because my uncle Alex was Jewish, in 1938, when he was just 12 years old, he was not allowed to continue in school any longer and instead was apprenticed, sent to work as a student electrician in a factory in the nearby city of Győr. I've often wondered what my grandfather, Alex's and my mother's father, thought about those anti-Jewish laws. My grandfather was proud of his own service in the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I, and he considered himself to be a Hungarian patriot. He often said that he thought of himself as a Hungarian first and a Jew second. I suppose it's fortunate that he died of natural causes late in 1939, before the worst of the Holocaust in Hungary. So as the war continued, the day-to-day lives of Jews became more and more miserable, with shortages of food, clothes, and other essentials. Worse, the government began to draft able-bodied Jewish men into forced labor battalions. My Uncle Joe, who was already serving as an officer in the Hungarian army before the war, was stripped of his rank and his weapons were taken away. My Uncle Louis, who was living and working in Győr, was next to be taken into a forced labor battalion. He and my Uncle Alex had been living together there in Győr, and Alex missed his older brother, who had been a father figure for him since the death of his own father. Louis's labor battalion was later sent to the Russian front. After Louis, my Uncle Paul was conscripted. His labor battalion stayed and worked in Hungary. During this time, my mother had been living and working in Ugod, another nearby village in that area of Hungary. So this was a time of great fear and uncertainty, even for those remaining in their homes, like my mother, my grandmother, and my young Aunt Pitty. They worried about their missing brothers, sons, and husbands, and they had growing fears about what might come next. And there was uncertainty about what had been happening and about what might happen next. Then, in early 1944, things in Hungary changed drastically and for the worse. And here's what happened. The Hungarian government realized that Nazi Germany was losing the war, and the government wanted to declare Hungary neutral and make peace with the United States and the other allies, as Italy had already done by that point in the war. When Nazi Germany found out about this, they occupied Hungary and installed a puppet government led by the Arrow-Cross, or Hungarian Nazi Party. The principles of the Arrow-Cross Party included extreme nationalism and militant anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews. They ascribed to the German master race worldview, believing that Germans, and of course in their minds, true Hungarians like themselves, constituted master races. So Nazi occupation of Hungary began in March of 1944, and the German and Hungarian Nazis moved quickly to impose the most brutal of Nazi policies on Hungarian Jews. As an omen of more to come, they immediately required all Jews to wear yellow stars and armbands. So we've reached the last 12 months or so of the war, but this brief period of 12 or 14 months before the war ended was unfortunately plenty of time for the Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators. My family in Hungary probably didn't fully comprehend the situation. They had no access to accurate news or radio reports, but here in the United States, by this point in the war, the government and the media were well aware of what was going to happen. President Roosevelt himself said that hundreds of thousands of Jews face death, and he was right. But our government and the other allies did little more than urge resistance to the local populations. Frankly, I wonder how President Roosevelt and the US government expected the people of Hungary to even get that message to resist. And I wonder if that message was more for themselves so they could feel like they had done something. So until the Nazi occupation of Hungary in March of 1944, my grandmother Aronka and my young Aunt Pitty had been living in their longtime home village of Széll. With the Nazi occupation, the Hungarian puppet government began a program of concentrating Hungarian Jews in ghetto areas. Uncle Alex was by then 18 years of age, and he was still working at the factory in Győr. One day in June, he saw a schedule calling for rural Jews to be moved from their homes to designated rural ghetto areas, and he saw that the Jews in Széll, his hometown, were scheduled to be moved to a nearby town's ghetto in Czarna on a date in the middle of June. Not knowing when he might see his family members again, he decided that he wanted to be with his mother and sister to help with that move to Czarna. Early in the morning, a day or two before the scheduled date, Alex got hold of a bicycle. He left his home, a rented room at 25 Bálint Mihály Street in Győr, and rode to Széll. That's about 30 miles away. In Széll, Uncle Alex helped his mother and sister pack up some clothes and food for the move. My grandmother even packed some firewood. They had been told by the government officials that they were being relocated to some nice farmland in Poland, where they would meet up with their missing family members. My grandmother, my young Aunt Pitty, and my Uncle Alex were taken by horse and wagon from Széll to Czarna. And in the Czarna ghetto, the three of them were assigned to a small room in one of the synagogues there. The room's floor was covered with straw, and there were several other rooms packed full of Jews. This small ghetto was guarded by a few Hungarian Nazis and German SS troops. Alex was allowed to stay with his family in the Czarna ghetto for only about a week before he was taken away for the first time to a forced labor battalion. Not long after Alex was taken from his family, I think that the Czarna Jews were moved to another larger ghetto area to the nearby city of Papa, about 20 miles from Széll. Here's a picture of my Aunt Petey and my grandmother Aronka. I think this photo was taken shortly before the family was forced to move to Chorna. My young aunt was 8 or 9 years old in this photo. Around that same time, the Nazis came for my mother and the other Jews in Ugod. They were also taken to the Papa ghetto, and for the next few weeks, my mother told me, she and other prisoners were taken daily to nearby farms for forced labor in cornfields. Then on Thursday, July 6, 1944, all the Jews in the Papa ghetto were rounded up by German and Hungarian troops. On that day, with thousands of other Hungarian Jews from the countryside, my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt were forced into railroad cattle cars, and they were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. My mother's train arrived at the Auschwitz camp the next day, Friday, July 7, 1944. At Auschwitz, they were forced off the train and lined up. As the line moved forward, my grandmother and my aunt were directed to the left with the other elderly people and children, and my mother was directed to the right with the other able-bodied Hungarian Jews. I don't think my mother knew at the time what the significance of those left and right directions were, but my grandmother and aunt probably were dead before the end of that day. Standing in line by the train was the last time my mother saw my grandmother or my aunt. Now, around the same time in Kunziget, the authorities moved to gather up the 1 or 2 Jewish families living there for the ultimate deportation to Auschwitz, although they didn't know about that at the time. But the parish priest in Kunziget, my great-grandfather's friend, must have had some premonition, if not knowledge. He tried to hide my family members in the basement of the puplot or rectory where he lived. Now, unfortunately, they were found and they were deported to Auschwitz. Lajos was about 80 years old and Roji was about 73. Gizush was about 30. And the girls, Vera and Zsófi, were less than 10. If they survived that deportation process, there's no doubt that as elderly people and as a mother with young children, they all would have been killed as soon as they arrived at Auschwitz. On a visit to Hungary a few years ago, I went to Kunziget looking for information about that parish priest who tried to save my family members. I knew, of course, that my relatives had been found and murdered, but I wondered about the priest who tried to hide them. Had he been punished or even killed? From the mayor of Kunziget, I learned that the priest's name was Peter Vichy, and that he survived the war and in fact continued to serve as the parish priest for many years, including into the 1950s. And I found a memorial plaque on the Catholic Church in the town square, just a few feet from where my great-grandparents lived and from the puplot basement where Father Peter Vichy tried to hide them. It lists the names of the people in Kunziget who died during the war, including my family members. My family members were, of course, far from alone in being murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. And here in the United States, by July of 1944, the government and media were reporting on the plight of Hungarian Jews. But unfortunately, as you now know, it was already too late. The mass deportations by train had begun on May 15, 1944, and this diagram on the screen illustrates those deportations. Are any of you familiar with Elie Wiesel's book, Night? Looks like quite a few of you have read that. It tells the story of 15-year-old Elie Wiesel and his family during the Holocaust, another individual person's story of the war. You might be interested to see that here's the village where Elie and his family lived before they were sent to Auschwitz in one of the earliest of the Hungarian deportations. And do any of you recognize the name Eva Kor? Looks like a lot of you do. I know that she's spoken at this conference in the past. She's, of course, a well-known Holocaust survivor who founded the Candles Museum in Terre Haute. You might be interested to see the location from which Eva Kor and her sister and the rest of her family were deported. They're up on the screen. Today, this is part of Romania, as is Elie Wiesel's home. But during the early years of the war, this was an area that was returned to Hungarian rule by the Nazis. I'd like to focus for a few minutes on one small detail of this mass deportation, and that is the railroad cattle cars typically used for the deportation to Auschwitz. Here are some photos of typical cars. In his book Night, towards the beginning, Elie Wiesel describes the railroad cattle car that he and his family were loaded into with other Jews from his village. He said a total of 80 of them in his car for their 2 or 3 day journey to Auschwitz. And outside Eva Kor's Candles Museum is a set of rusting railroad tracks, which I think Eva felt was symbolic of her and her family's deportation. So during this mass deportation process of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, 50 to 100 Jews with whatever single bag or luggage they could carry were crowded into these railroad cars for 1 to 4 days and nights. Try to imagine that, a whole day and night, or even up to 4 days and nights. There wasn't enough room for everyone to sit on the floor at the same time. The only food they had was what they brought with them. They often weren't even given water. There was no restroom for the length of that multi-day journey, 1 to 4 days, just an open bucket in a corner, or maybe a hole cut into the floor. Not surprisingly, many died on these railroad cars before they even reached Auschwitz. This Nazi-led and Hungarian-assisted deportation of Jews was extremely efficient and, in fact, well documented. Within just 8 weeks, the countryside was emptied of its Jewish population, starting in the eastern part of the country. The Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators killed around 500,000 Hungarian Jews during the last 12 or 14 months of the war. Now that's a staggering number, 500,000. And I think it's hard to comprehend a number that big in real terms, whether you're a child or an adult. For my school groups, I try to illustrate this sad statistic in various ways to try to make it a little bit more understandable at a personal level. For example, I'm sure all of you have been on 4 or 5 hour car trips, is that right? So how many of you have driven to St. Louis, Missouri? Looks like a few of you have. How about Madison, Wisconsin? Another college town. How about Cincinnati, Ohio? Yep, lots of you there. If you lined up 500,000 people sitting single file in seats like yours, the line would stretch for about 284 miles. For example, from downtown West Lafayette to a few miles past downtown St. Louis, downtown Madison, or downtown Cincinnati. And we're talking about 500,000 murders. That means about 1,350 murders every day for 12 straight months. So you may have been watching the slideshow of faces that's been running on that small computer down there since I began. One face every 60 seconds. That's the average rate, 7 days a week, day and night, 24 hours a day, at which the Nazis and their collaborators murdered just Hungarian Jews during just the last 12 months of the war. One murder every minute. In the 35 minutes or so that I've talked so far, you've seen about 35 people's faces. They are real victims of the Holocaust. Each one represents, and in fact is, a Hungarian Jew who was murdered during that time. But this slideshow of faces is not just an abstract representation for me, or for my parents, or for my Uncle Alex. Each of the murdered people, the faces you've seen, is a member of our own family. Uncles and aunts, cousins, grandparents, great uncles, great aunts. These were people, our family, many of whom my mother or my father or Uncle Alex knew well, and that I have never had a chance to know myself because they were murdered in the Holocaust. So I showed you some pre-war family photos earlier. Here's another collection of ones that you've seen, and I've marked those who died in the Holocaust. I won't leave you in suspense about my mother's fate at Auschwitz and afterwards. After my mother's group was directed to the right, her head was shaved and her clothes were taken, although they let her keep her shoes. She and the rest of her group were given rough prison clothes to wear, and that began my mother's stay at the Auschwitz concentration camp. In Auschwitz, she lived in barracks C3 with hundreds of other women. She told me that it was near the kitchen building, and I've marked its location here on this diagram. The barracks were very crowded, and they were given very little food and no medical attention. They had no utensils for eating what little food they were given. And most days at Auschwitz, my mother and the other women in her barracks were taken out and forced to move stones and rocks by hand for a railroad line the Germans were building. It was a brutal life. Early every morning, a German overseer, a woman, counted them. My mother told me that this German guard or overseer always wore a starched white blouse and was named Irma Gressa. Nearly every day, one or more of the women died from starvation, disease, beatings, or other abuse. Now, after about 5 weeks at Auschwitz, on August 15, 1944, my mother got lucky. Along with 86 other women from Block C3, she was selected to go to a factory work camp. They were put on a train and taken to the Guben slave labor camp about 80 miles southeast of Berlin. This time, instead of a cattle car, the Nazis used a passenger car. But it was stuffed so full that some of the women had to lie on the overhead luggage racks. At Guben, every night my mother worked an overnight 12-hour shift at a factory that produced radio equipment for German aircraft. The living conditions were still terrible, but they were better than Auschwitz. A few months later, the Soviet army invaded Germany, and in January of 1945, with the Soviet-Russian troops approaching, the Nazis forced my mother and the other slave workers at Guben to leave on foot, beginning a brutal forced march journey in the dead of winter. Many were killed or froze to death along the way, and those who survived the death march, like my mother, arrived several weeks later at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp near Hannover in northern Germany. I'm sure you all have read or heard about the diary of Anne Frank, a young Jew who hid with her family from the Nazis in Amsterdam. While it's not part of her diary, you probably know that Anne Frank and her family were discovered and captured. Anne Frank and her sister ended up at Bergen-Belsen, and they both died there at around the time my mother arrived at that camp. Just a few weeks later, on April 15, 1945, British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen and were shocked at what they found there. Thousands were dead and dying, and thousands had died at Bergen-Belsen even after the British liberation. My mother was still alive, but just barely. Let me return to Uncle Alex's story. You'll remember that I last described how in June of 1944 he was separated from his mother and sister Piti in the Chorna ghetto, and he was put into a slave labor battalion, and for the next 9 months he worked on farms and factories and digging anti-tank trenches by hand, mostly in western Hungary near his home and in Austria near the Hungarian border. Alex actually escaped and was recaptured several times. With the brutally cold and snowy winter of 1944 and 1945, making it difficult to survive in the countryside. Sometimes farmers or even childhood friends were able to help Alex temporarily, but there was no place for him to hide permanently. And by the spring of 1945, he was working at a Nazi-run factory in Austria near the Hungarian border. In late March, Russian troops arrived and liberated the factory and Alex's group. Actually, the Russians packed up the factory equipment and the able-bodied workers and shipped them off to Russia for their own purposes. Alex, though, was left behind because he was so sick and weak and expected to die. But after a few days, he regained some strength, and Alex decided to walk back to his home in Hungary. A few people helped him along the way by giving him milk and bread. And along the road, he told me he saw abandoned German and Hungarian trucks and other vehicles. The Germans had run out of gasoline and diesel fuel by that point in the war. Alex arrived in Seal on April 10, 1945. He found his house, but it had been stripped of the family's furniture and belongings. He kicked out a squatter and took back the empty house. But with the house empty and unlivable, he decided to stay with some childhood Christian friends in Seal. In May or June, just a month or two later, his brother Paul returned to Seal. Paul had been liberated from a labor battalion in eastern Hungary, where he'd been held as slave labor for several years. In June, the new Seal police chief helped Alex and Paul borrow a wagon and a horse, and they went around the town with the police chief, taking back some of their family's furniture and possessions from neighbors who had taken them after the deportation in 1944. My mother, Alex's sister Manci, didn't return until October of 1945. After being liberated from Bergen-Belsen, she was too weak and sick to travel, and she remained near Bergen-Belsen at a displaced persons camp for several months until she was well enough to return home. Alex's brother Joe didn't return until late 1946, over a year after the war had ended. Joe had been injured by shrapnel, captured by the Russians, and held as a prisoner of war in Russia until well after the war. So 4 of the Chiluk family siblings survived. The family eventually learned from the Red Cross that brother Louis had been killed on the Russian front, where German troops used his Hungarian labor battalion to clear a minefield by walking through it. Mother Anonka and sister Piri were, as you know, murdered at Auschwitz. Now, my father's family didn't fare as well. Among his parents, brothers, sisters, wife, and young children, he was the only survivor. So what you've heard me talk about today is just a small part of Holocaust history. The story of some of my family members, the experiences of just a few of the millions of Jews and others devastated by the Holocaust. I hope these personal stories help you better appreciate the significance of the Holocaust and why we still remember and study it over 75 years later. But a history lesson isn't the only reason to study the war and the Holocaust. Another more important reason is, well, the theme of this year's conference, preventing evil by remembering, connecting, educating, and learning. That is, we need to try to learn from history to help make sure that the same mistakes by governments and by ordinary people are not repeated. To do that, I think we need to ask ourselves some questions. Questions like, how could this have happened? How could governments, how could people, even ordinary people, much like us, for example, allow such horrific, such obviously profoundly wrong things to occur? And what can we do to try to prevent these things from happening again? I can't tell you that I have all the answers, and I think it's important that each of us thinks about these questions for ourselves. But there are a few lessons that I think are important, and I'd like to share them with you this evening. Lesson number 1 is that it is still happening. Don't think for a minute that it's not. Mass violence and even genocide are in fact still happening today. Racially based hatred and violence are still going on. We, human beings, haven't learned enough from our past mistakes. Genocides and mass atrocities are occurring today. For example, in Syria, in the Middle East, in Darfur, in the Western Sudan, in Africa, in China, against the Uyghur people and other mostly Muslim ethnic groups in the northwestern part of the country, with the Rohingya people, a Muslim minority in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, in Asia. I regret to say that these are all recent and in fact current examples. In Myanmar, the country's army has been actively burning villages where the Rohingya people live, forcing them to flee the country. Nearly 1 million Rohingya have fled, becoming refugees in neighboring Bangladesh. And none of this is a secret, it's well known. Here's a summary of a years-old United Nations report detailing some of the terrible, unthinkable things done by the military and the government and the people of Myanmar. Now, note that this is all shockingly reminiscent of what the Nazis did during the Holocaust, and it continues in Myanmar even today. The focus of the Kokomo Library Holocaust exhibit, that is what Americans and the American government knew and did about the Holocaust when it was happening, should make us think about what Americans today know and what we are doing about genocides and mass atrocities that are happening around the world today. Even with our massively enhanced access to news and information through the internet, are we hearing enough? Are we doing enough? What will history's judgment of us be 75 or 80 years from now? And incidents of racially based violence, short of genocide, are unfortunately even more frequent and are happening all around the world as well. I'm sure many of you recall the shootings at 2 mosques in New Zealand a few years ago. 51 people were killed and dozens more injured in the attack that was carried out by an Australian-born white supremacist and avowed fascist. And unfortunately, white nationalism is gaining ground all over. The photos that you see here on the right side of the screen are from the United States and from Europe. And white supremacist groups, such as the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, were among the most organized and dangerous, if not deadly, members of the violent mob of traitors that overran our nation's capital in January of 2021. Now, throughout Europe, the heartland of the World War II Holocaust, the lessons from the past seem to have been forgotten. There are widespread reports of rising anti-Semitism in Europe today, many involving populist or nationalist or nativist political parties. Those kinds of parties have gained popular support and positions in the governments of many European countries in recent years. And they often use anti-Jewish speech and symbolism to further their purposes. A while ago, I read a report on an incident in eastern France where over 100 tombstones in an old Jewish cemetery were spray painted with Nazi symbols. And unfortunately, this incident was only one of over 40 anti-Jewish attacks in that part of France over the prior 18 months. A local rabbi commenting on the cemetery vandalism made a noteworthy observation. He said, "Hatred that begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews." I thought about that rabbi's observation as I read a newspaper report about a German man who tried to attack and kill 80 Jews worshiping in a synagogue a while ago. The German shooter was unable to get in, but he shot a woman who happened to be passing by on the street, and he also shot a man at a nearby Turkish restaurant, no doubt assuming he was Muslim. Hatred that begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews. Closer to home, here in Indiana, anti-Semitism can be found. A few years ago, in a North Indianapolis suburb, a synagogue or Jewish church was graffitied with Nazi flags and iron crosses. 2 months later, Nazi swastikas were found drawn on mirrors and countertops in a boys' restroom at Pike High School on the west side of Indianapolis. And unfortunately, there's plenty more Indiana examples of apparent anti-Semitism. In Westfield, at the University of Indianapolis on Indianapolis South Side, in Noblesville, north of Indianapolis, and in August of 2020, at the high school gym in Daleville, a small town between Anderson and Munci. And here are some Zionsville high school boys performing a Nazi salute in their gym. And even more recently, a Lawrence man pled guilty to hate crimes that included burning a wooden cross and displaying a swastika to frighten and intimidate his neighbor, who was a black family. In Bloomington, Jewish symbols, mezuzahs on doorways, were targeted and vandalized. In Indianapolis, a woman was charged with committing a hate crime after she intentionally rammed her car into a building that she thought was a Jewish day school. In Fort Wayne, a man was arrested for threatening to murder Jews and government officials that he considered pro-Israeli. And in a near downtown Indianapolis neighborhood recently, someone distributed flyers advocating white supremacist and anti-Semitic views. And the numbers are on the rise. The conflict in Gaza between Hamas and Israel seems to have provoked increased outbreaks of both anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim incidents, including at Indiana colleges and universities. A U.S. Deputy Attorney General told ABC News in December of last year that nationwide there have been more than 1,800 threats and tips related to the October 7 attacks and the ensuing war, and more than 100 related criminal investigations are open nationwide. That was in December. I'm sure there's more now. These recent incidents seem to demonstrate a local Indiana vein of white supremacist and anti-Jewish feeling. And at a more personal level, even if some of these examples are somehow more innocent or unintended than they seem to be, maybe kids who didn't fully understand what they were doing, or adults suffering from mental or drug problems, imagine how these kinds of incidents and reminders and symbol feel to people like my parents or my Uncle Alex, who survived the Holocaust, but saw so many members of their family murdered. So lesson number 2, I think, is that words and symbols matter. Racially based hate speech is unfortunately happening all around the world. I mentioned earlier the murders at the New Zealand mosques. The shooter in that attack intentionally targeted Muslims, and he said that he was inspired by, that he got the idea to attack and kill people from the hate speeches and writings of other white supremacists and white nationalists. This is common with the perpetrators of hate crimes. They're inspired and encouraged by the writings of others, these days often from internet sources, chat rooms, Twitter, or X. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers at Auschwitz. It began with words, the hate speeches of Nazi leaders that encouraged violence against Jews, and it continued with written words and symbols, with laws that were adopted to dehumanize Jews and strip them of their rights as human beings. I think this history is important, and the importance of words and symbols is something we need to remember today, especially as we hear politicians or others lay blame on certain groups or outsiders for problems, real or perceived, in our own country. In Hungary, the Hungarian government and the majority Fidesz party, a right-wing party that controls the government, claim that they are not anti-Semitic, despite a long history of anti-Jewish statements and actions. And they continue to do and say things that encourage anti-Jewish attitudes today. For example, the Hungarian government has in recent years conducted a campaign against a well-known Jewish Hungarian-born financier and philanthropist, George Soros. They accuse him of being too liberal and of bringing Muslims into Europe. On my trip to Hungary in 2019, I saw these anti-Soros billboards and posters. The billboard on the upper right side of the slide illustrates Soros and his friends supposedly cutting through the chain link fence that Hungary put up on its southern border to help keep out Muslim refugees from Syria. Now, these billboards and posters don't overtly say anything anti-Jewish, but it didn't take long for graffiti to appear. In this poster, Soros has been labeled "stinking Jew," in Hungarian, of course. And although my photos here are from 2019, I know that the government campaign is continuing today. For example, here's a current government poster from earlier this year attacking George Soros' son and the president of the European Union. It says in Hungarian, "Let's not dance to their tune." I thought about symbols a few weeks ago when my wife and I drove down to Florida to escape the Indiana winter for a few days of warmth and sunshine. We crossed the Georgia state line, and I suddenly noticed Confederate flags everywhere, along the road, at gas stations, at stores. I know that for some the Confederate flag is not offensive. It's seen as just a symbol of Southern heritage. But at the same time, those who display it must also recognize that to many, the Confederate flag represents slavery, oppression of people of color, and white supremacy. And today, the Confederate flag is regularly weaponized by neo-Nazi and far-right extremist groups as they seek to intimidate Black Americans and others. And the Confederate flag has also been used to target Jewish Americans, as it was when it was tied to the front doors of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City in February of 2021. Symbols are powerful. The Confederate flag at the Jewish Museum in New York, the Nazi swastika spray painted on the Jewish temple in Indianapolis, or on the gravestones at the cemetery in France, the yellow star that Jews were made to wear during the Holocaust, flags used at white supremacist rallies, the burning cross and the swastika that man in Lawrence displayed. These symbols are meant to, and effectively do, intimidate and dehumanize. Another example of dehumanization is the way the Nazis numbered the Jews at Auschwitz. My father had a tattoo on his left arm. This photo on the screen isn't my father, but this man's tattoo looks very much like the one my father had. I remember when I was very young asking him about that tattoo. All he said was, the Nazis did that. To the Nazis, he was a number, not a person. That kind of mentality led only too naturally to brutal and deadly so-called medical and scientific experiments on Jews, on living people at Auschwitz. And I want to add that, in my view, words matter both ways. Simply refraining from hate speech is not enough. I think it's important that politicians and government and other leaders and ordinary people like us consistently and emphatically speak out against hate speech and symbols of hatred, and against those who propose or advocate for violence against outsiders or minorities. Words matter. That leads, I think, to lesson number 3, which is personal responsibility. Closing our eyes, relying on someone else to do the right thing, is not acceptable. That's what happened in the 1930s when the Nazis in Germany ramped up their campaign against Jews, and we know where that led. In the last few years, we've seen a sharp increase in violence, bullying, and hate crimes against Americans of Asian descent. Between March of 2020 and March of 2022, there were more than 11,400 hate incidents against Asian Americans reported across the United States, and the rate is increasing. A report found that hate crimes against Asian minorities, Asian Americans, increased 139% in 2021 compared to 2020 nationwide. Indiana is not immune. Last year, in Bloomington, an 18-year-old IU student was stabbed several times in the head, simply for being Chinese. Her attacker, a 56-year-old white woman, openly admitted that she committed this crime simply because the student was Chinese. This irrational hatred seems to have originated with politicians and others referring to COVID as the China virus. Another example, maybe, of words matter. Now, this is personal for me, and not just because of my family's Holocaust history. My wife and I adopted our daughter from Korea when she was 4 months old. I hate to think that she or her children, my grandchildren, have to worry about being attacked just because they happen to look Asian. Fortunately, people are speaking out about this problem. And all of us as individuals have the responsibility to speak out when we see wrongs or when we see bullying. Silence or indifference and inaction is not staying out of it. The practical and real effect of silence and inaction always favors the victimizer or the bully. It never helps the victim. The Nazis led the Holocaust, but in carrying it out, they also relied on the indifference of others, on a conspiracy of silence. I think there's a special responsibility on elected officials, on civic leaders, and on those working in professional and educated occupations. The Holocaust could not have been possible without the complicity, at least through silence, of people like politicians, lawyers, judges, teachers and educators, government administrators and employees, physicians, church leaders, engineers, architects, and others who themselves maybe weren't Nazis, but who should have been thought leaders and sounded the alarm. But everyone, all of us, have a personal responsibility. If a few sympathetic people hadn't helped my Uncle Alex in the winter of 1944 and 1945, he might not have survived. So remember this, if nothing else. The Holocaust was not an accident in history. It occurred because governments and organizations and individuals made choices, including in some cases inaction, that legitimized discrimination and allowed prejudice, hatred, bullying, and ultimately even mass murder to occur. But I'd like to wind up on a little bit more of a positive note. You should know that the survivors in my family have kept the family's Holocaust stories and memories of the victims alive. And during a visit to Hungary a few years ago, I recreated Uncle Alex's 1944 bicycle ride from Győr to Széll. I left from the address where he lived in Győr and rode on the same road he took towards the town of Csorna. A couple hours later, I reached the city limits of Csorna. Through a relative in Hungary, I had become acquainted with a Hungarian high school teacher there, and I stopped at the teacher's school. He came out with one of his history classes, and we walked a block and a half to the old Jewish cemetery there. The teacher led us to my grandfather's grave, which also has inscribed on his tombstone the names of his wife and children murdered in the Holocaust. Their bodies were never found, of course. And I also spoke to the history class about my family in the Holocaust. Afterwards, I continued my bicycle ride from Csorna to Széll, again on the same road that Uncle Alex had last taken in 1944. I had an easier time of it than he did. The road was paved, while in 1944 it was still dirt and gravel, and Jews were being hunted by the government. Széll is nearby, so I soon arrived at Alex's destination, the address where my grandparents' house had been. Meanwhile, I had received a text message from the high school teacher. The mayor of Széll, he told me, was expecting me, and I needed to stop and see her. She was very welcoming, and a few days later, again through the high school teacher's assistance, I returned to Széll and gave a Holocaust presentation, much like the one you're listening to today, at a meeting of a local historical society held at the City Hall in Széll, literally just a few blocks from my grandparents' home. Several local Széll residents came up and talked with me afterwards. Some remembered their parents talking about my family. And after the presentation, with another speaker, a second-generation Polish-Hungarian woman, we placed a wreath at Széll's World War II memorial to honor those lost in the war. The local newspaper picked up the story, and my bicycle ride made the front page. So my family didn't forget, and through Holocaust education opportunities like the presentation you're seeing today, like my bike ride and speaking in Hungary, I helped to make sure that the family stories are remembered. And I think it's important to add that not only did the survivors not forget, but that many of them went on to rebuild their lives. They helped each other, they married, they had children, and they continued to celebrate their customs and religion. I think a lot of survivors believed that that was the best revenge or retribution for what had happened to them and to their families. The 4 Csillag siblings who survived had 10 children, including me, 24 grandchildren, and so far 21 great-grandchildren. Each of the photos that you see here on the screen includes at least one survivor. And you see them here with their children, grandchildren, and other family members. So thank you for listening to me today. And I would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
How did your father and mother get together? Was it not until after the war?
Well, the question is, how do my parents meet or get together? That's actually a fairly complicated question. They didn't know each other at all before the war, and after the war, my mother actually married someone. It was, you remember her aunt Gizush? She actually married Gizush's husband. And Gizush was, of course, dead by then. And they had one child, my brother. And then her first husband died of leukemia in 1949. And so she was a single mother. And one day she was in the park in Győr, and her son, who would have been 5 years old maybe, saw my father sitting on a park bench, and he told my mother, "Oh, there's a nice looking gentleman. Why don't you go talk to him?" So my brother introduced my parents. is how my parents met.
So you mentioned that you heard stories from your parents, but it wasn't until your uncle, with whom you were quite close, really started conveying the stories and providing more of the family history.
Yeah.
How did your parents sort of relate the Holocaust to you?
Yeah. Well, they didn't. The question is, how did my parents relate the Holocaust to me? Did they talk about it, et cetera? My father, literally the only thing I ever heard my father say about the Holocaust was the Nazis did that. He didn't say, I never heard him say anything about it. And my mother didn't really talk about the Holocaust either. She would tell me stories when I was young. I'm sure, your parents did the same thing about other kids that she played with or the school she went to and what they learned and that sort of thing, most of which I sort of tuned out, but which I regret now. But I remember I would often say, well, where is, that cousin or that friend? Why don't I know that person? And the aunt, she would get like a sad look on her face and say, oh, they perished in the Holocaust. And so really, my parents didn't really talk about the Holocaust, but at the same time, there was never a time that I didn't kind of know about it to a certain extent. I remember one time when I was probably in 3rd or 4th grade, and we had a snow day from school, and I think I was bored, and I went into the dining room and opened up the buffet, and in the back of one of the drawers, I found a small cloth bag, and I dumped it out on the dining room table, and I found a bunch of pieces of gold jewelry, broken pieces of rings, and back of a watch. There were several gold caps from teeth, and I asked my mother, what is this? Why do we have this? And that's the first time she told me about how she and her mother, my grandmother, one time when they were visiting in the spring of, I think it would have been the winter actually, of 1943, 1944, they liquidated their possessions and took whatever jewelry they had, and the two of them buried them out in the woods behind the house that my mother was living in Ugod. And after the war, my mother was the only one who knew where those were buried, and she came back with her brothers and dug up this treasure. There were gold coins in it then, but they spent a lot of that money kind of trying to rebuild their lives after the war. So, my parents didn't really relate to the Holocaust, never really talked about it. I probably learned the most from my mother in the late 1980s, or maybe it was the early 1990s, when she was contacted by the Claims Conference. If any of you are familiar with that, it's a reparations fund that was established by the German government and is run by a foundation in Switzerland. And so she applied for benefits to this fund, and I helped her fill the forms out, and the forms asked very specific questions about where were you, who were you with, and that's really the first time I heard from my mother anything in chronological order or close to it about what had happened to her. Turns out that she had a fantastic memory, including for dates. So you heard some very specific dates here, and based on the research that I've done, they seem to be accurate. And then when after I retired from working full time, I decided to become active in the Holocaust Speakers Bureau. My uncle Alex had done a little bit of that already, and so he lived nearby, so I got together with him, and he started sharing photos, many of which I'd seen at one time or another, and he was able to tell me, who these people were. And by that point, both my parents were gone, so they couldn't help. So I kind of put all that together, and I put it onto kind of a timeline of World War II history, just to understand why was it in July of 1944 that my family was shipped off to Auschwitz, and once I kind of had all the pieces, it really fit together. Yes.
This is not meant to be insensitive. How did they keep the photos, or how did you find the photos? Did they put them in safekeeping or something?
Well, that's a great question. Why do I have so many photos from before World War II? Is sort of the question. And when I first started joining the Speakers Bureau, we had a 6-week training program, and there were several of us in the program. What had happened is the actual survivors were sort of running out of steam or dying from old age, and so they recruited some second generation folks to step in. And so one of the things we did was put together a sample presentation. And one of the other members of the group said, "Tibor, why do you have so many photos? I have one," And I was stunned. I said, "I don't know. I'll have to find out." Fortunately, Uncle Alex was still alive, and he explained to me that, remember my great-grandparents who had the 9 children? Mm-hmm. Well, one of them left Hungary before World War I and ended up in Cleveland. And also one of his brothers ended up with him in Cleveland between the wars. And so the family had a few relatives in Cleveland. And when things happened, weddings or whatever, they would send photos to the American relatives. And so after we immigrated, Alex contacted those relatives and made copies of all those photos for my family and my Uncle Paul and Uncle Joe's family as well. So that's where the pictures came from. And also I've been liberal with cropping photos and, picking faces here and there and putting together in different combinations. No AI used for any of that, simply cropping. I did try an AI enhancement on one of the photos of my Uncle Louis, who I never knew. And it was interesting. It gave him a nice, very modern looking, beard type thing. So don't trust AI. More questions?
Not a question, actually, just a comment, because I am also second generation survivor. And you asked before who comes from a large family. So my father was one of 11 and my mother was one of 5, but my mother was the only survivor and my father and his brother were the only survivors.
Yeah.
So, had they all survived, I would have been a very large family, but really very small because I never knew my grandparents.
Yeah, right.
So, and my parents too didn't really talk about it. I have pictures. And I need to get somebody who maybe can understand Polish because they were from Poland. And it's unfortunate, but kind of later in their lives, and my dad became legally blind, so he couldn't look at them anymore and see them. We did get some pictures from other families who, kind of crisscrossed. So I do have a lot of pictures. I had a brother who was actually born in Germany. He didn't. So he passed away in Israel. But yeah, it's interesting because it's very difficult at times. You know, I think I would like to go to Germany, but I don't know if I can take it.
Yeah. Well, document that information as best you can, and it is hard. I have several cousins, as you know from the presentation, and I've talked to several of them about whether they would like these materials and do their own speaking. They can easily adapt them for their own, piece of the family, but they don't want to do it. It's too sad. It's too difficult, and they want to forget. So,
I don't want to forget. I just
well,
personal.
yeah. Well, I don't want to argue with them, but forgetting is not the answer. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
How many first Holocaust survivors and second generation are in the Speakers Bureau?
Well, there are about a dozen active speakers right now. Most of them are second or even third generation. I think actively speaking, there's really only one right now, and she was from Poland, and she was 2 years old maybe when the war started, and her parents asked a neighbor to take her and to pretend that she was their child. So she was a hidden child during the war. And she really tells a very touching story. I mean, she had a very difficult time when her, I think just her mother showed up after the war to reclaim her, and she didn't recognize her, didn't know who she was. So yeah, we're running out of eyewitnesses, but there's no denying, what happened. Thank you. Thank you.